Welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're going to try to untangle this really interesting case. It's got like international legal drama, accusations about politics. Oh, and you can't forget social media's role in all of it.
Yeah, it really does make you think about like how far the law goes in our digital world these days.
Exactly.
It's fascinating, really.
So let's jump right in. Okay, so we've got this guy, Rickford Burke, and he's a Guyanese political activist, a human rights activist, and he's been living in the U.S. for over 20 years.
Right.
But now he's facing some accusations from Anil Nandlall, and he's the Attorney General in Guyana.
Right.
And to make things even more interesting, the U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland is involved, too.
Yeah, and see, the thing is, Nandlall is saying that Burke is using his Facebook page to, like, stir up racial hostility and violence in Guyana.
Right.
Almost every day, according to him.
Wow, daily. That's a strong accusation.
I
So what's Burke saying about all this?
Well, Burke is fighting back. He's saying the Guyanese government is trying to frame him. And that he hasn't even been in Guyana for, like, over 2 decades.
So hold on. We've got someone in the U.S. being accused of causing trouble in another country through Facebook posts. That's got to be some uncharted legal territory, right?
You got it. This case could really force the international legal community to rethink how they define inciting violence in this whole digital age. I mean, will they come up with a global definition? And how will they handle freedom of speech when they need to prevent violence? These are questions a lot of lawmakers around the world will have to deal with as we see more and more cases like this one.
It's wild. But let's focus on Nandlall's argument here. He's talking about the Constitution in Guyana, right?
Right. He's saying that while Guyana's constitution guarantees freedom of expression, it also protects against hate speech or anything that could cause hostility. Like, he's arguing that Burke's posts are crossing a line.
So are we seeing one country's laws trying to reach into another country's jurisdiction?
You hit the nail on the head there. This question of jurisdiction is a tricky one, especially with online activity. Does the U.S. have the authority to prosecute Burke, even though the alleged crime happened in Guyana? Or is this under Guyana's jurisdiction, because that's where the harm is happening? It's like a legal gray area that courts are still trying to figure out.
That's why we have you here to break it down for us. Okay, but before we dive too deep into this legal battle, what about these extortion allegations against Burke? It almost sounds like a movie plot.
It does, doesn't it? But these allegations are serious. They're accusing Burke of extorting money from Guyanese businesses.
And I read that there's actual evidence for these claims. Something about a sting operation.
Yeah, according to what we have, there was this police sting operation where they used marked bills. It resulted in a bunch of arrests, and there's even a written confession from one of the people they arrested, directly implicating Burke as the one running the whole extortion scheme.
And here's the unexpected part. The source material mentioned that the person who first reported Burke to the Guyanese police was actually the supposed victim of the extortion.
Exactly. So it wasn't just the government going after him. There was this independent complaint that started the whole investigation. It makes things even more complicated.
So we've got incitement accusations, extortion accusations, international legal questions, and now the U.S. Attorney General, Merrick Garland, is pulled in. How did that even happen?
Well, Nandlall took his case straight to Merrick Garland. He sent him a formal letter asking for Burke to be arrested and prosecuted here in the U.S. Essentially, he's requesting Burke be extradited to Guyana to face charges.
I gotta admit, I don't know how extradition really works. I'm guessing it's not just asking nicely and they hand him over, is it?
No, it's definitely not a simple phone call between governments saying, hey, send this guy back. Extradition is a very specific process. There are treaties between countries that determine how it works. Evidence needs to be shown to a judge in the U.S., and the judge decides if it's enough to allow extradition. This whole process can drag on for years before it's resolved.
Sounds like Nandlall is really serious about holding Burke accountable under Guyanese law. But he's going even further, right? He's also challenging some claims Burke made to the FBI.
Yeah, he's talking about how Burke filed a complaint with the FBI, alleging that the Guyanese government was harassing him. He even claimed that they sent a Guyanese police officer all the way to his house in Brooklyn to hurt him.
Yeah, I remember that. Burke's basically saying he's the real victim here and that the Guyanese government is targeting him. He's calling the Attorney General's requests desperate and unlawful.
It's this he said, she said situation playing out with both sides accusing each other of doing wrong. And all of this, remember, is happening on social media, which just adds another layer of complexity to the whole mess.
Like a political thriller playing out online for everyone to see. But before we go on, let's make sure our listener really understands extradition, since it's such a big part of this case.
Think of it like this. If someone commits a crime in one state and runs to another, the state where the crime happened can ask to have that person sent back to face charges. Extradition between countries works kind of the same way, but it's way more complex because of treaties and international law.
That's a good way to put it. It's like a global manhunt. So now that we've laid the groundwork, let's dive into the political side of things in Guyana. I think that's where we'll start to see some of the motivations and dynamics at play here.
Absolutely. To really get this whole situation, we need to look closer at the politics in Guyana and how Burke fits into all of that.
Sounds like a good place to pick up next time. We'll be back for part 2 soon.
I bet you're wondering, what's the political situation in Guyana that would lead to all this drama?
You're right on the money. I have to admit, I don't know that much about Guyanese politics. It feels like to really understand this case, we need to know about the history, the tensions there.
Yeah, definitely. Guyana has a long history of, political tensions, often along ethnic lines. You've got this rivalry between the two big political parties that sometimes turns into accusations about discrimination and unfair treatment. You need to understand all that to really grasp this situation with Burke and the Attorney General.
Okay, that helps. So where does Burke fit in all of this? Which side is he on?
Buck's a pretty vocal critic of the current government. He uses his platform to speak out against what he sees as corruption, abuse of power. His supporters see him as a champion for the people, someone speaking for those who feel ignored. They believe he's bringing attention to real injustices.
But I'm guessing his critics see things differently.
Right. Oh, totally. His critics say he's actually causing division, stirring up trouble instead of finding solutions. They say his rhetoric is dangerous, that he's just trying to make things worse for his own political gain. They see him as someone who takes advantage of these divisions that already exist.
So Burke himself is kind of a polarizing figure, huh? That just makes this whole situation even more complicated. Do you think all these accusations are politically motivated? Or is there real evidence of wrongdoing?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's really hard to say for sure. It could be that Burke's posts went too far, but it's also possible that he's being targeted just because of his political views. It's hard to separate the two sometimes.
I feel like this case could affect how other countries handle these kinds of situations going forward.
Absolutely. It could set a precedent for how we deal with online speech that goes across borders, especially when it might be inflammatory. Governments everywhere are trying to figure out how to balance freedom of speech with, preventing violence and keeping things peaceful.
It's almost like the digital and physical worlds are crashing into each other, and we're still figuring out the rules.
You got it. And like I said before, this case could make international legal bodies rethink how they define incitement in the digital age. It's a tough challenge, figuring out a definition that works across different cultures and legal systems.
So what do you think happens next? Where do you see this going?
Yeah.
Will the U.S. actually extradite Burke to Guyana?
That's hard to predict. Even if the U.S. does decide to extradite him, remember, it'll be a long process. There are a lot of legal hoops to jump through, treaties to consider, evidence to present, and Burke's lawyers are going to fight hard to keep him here.
And let's not forget about the extortion allegations. How does that play into this whole mess?
The extortion charges could really throw a wrench in things. If Burke ends up being found guilty of those charges in Guyana, that might make it harder for him to fight extradition.
Because then he'd be facing serious criminal charges in addition to the incitement accusations.
Exactly. It's just a really tangled situation, and it's almost impossible to say for sure how it's all going to end. But one thing's for sure. This case could set some really important legal precedents and start a bigger conversation about free speech, jurisdiction, and how much power the internet really has in the 21st century.
So much to think about. This whole thing makes me consider the power dynamics between people and governments in the digital age. It feels like anyone with a social media account can become a target no matter where they live.
Yeah, that's a good point. It raises some important questions. Where do we draw the line between protected speech and speech that incites violence? Can governments restrict what people say online, even if it's coming from outside their borders? And how do we make sure people are held accountable for what they do online when it has real-world consequences?
Those are really tough questions. It feels like we're in uncharted territory.
In a lot of ways, we are. This whole case shows that our legal systems are still trying to catch up to the realities of the digital world.
Makes you wonder if we should all be worried about what we post online, doesn't it?
I don't think it's about being scared, but it definitely shows that we need to be more aware of how powerful our words and actions are online. What we say and do online can have effects that go way beyond our own little circle.
Right, it reminds us that the digital world isn't some separate reality. It's part of the real world with real-world consequences.
Exactly. And like this case shows us, those consequences can involve the law, even international law.
It is a lot to think about. This deep dive has been really enlightening, showing how complex these issues of international law, free speech, and the digital world really are. Is there anything else from our source material that we haven't touched on yet?
Actually, yeah, there's one more thing we haven't talked about yet. Burke's claim that a Guyanese police officer was sent to his house in Brooklyn. If that's true, it really raises questions about how far the Guyanese government might be willing to go to silence their critics.
Whoa, that's a serious accusation. Let's unpack that in part 3. Okay, so last time we were talking about this really intense accusation. Burke is saying that a Guyanese police officer was sent all the way to his home in Brooklyn. It sounds like something you'd see in a movie.
It does, right. But Burke's serious about this. He says he filed a complaint with the FBI saying this officer was sent to intimidate him, maybe even hurt him. If that's true, it really makes you wonder about how far the Guyanese government is willing to go, you know? And are they even playing by the rules?
So Burke is being accused of inciting violence in Guyana from the U.S., but he's also saying he's a victim of harassment coming from Guyana. It's like a legal battle going on across borders.
Exactly. It shows how tough it is for law enforcement in a world where everything's connected. The lines between online and real life are getting blurry. If Burke is telling the truth, then the Guyanese government might be doing things that could cause serious problems between our countries.
This whole case is like a chain reaction. Each new thing that comes out leads to more legal and political consequences. Do you think the FBI will actually investigate Burke's claim?
Hard to say, really. They get so many complaints, and they have to decide which ones are the most urgent. But if Burke has real evidence, then yeah, the FBI might look into it.
And what if they find out he's right? That would put the U.S. in a tough spot, wouldn't it?
Definitely. It would put a strain on things between the U.S. and Guyana. It could lead to sanctions or other actions. It also makes you wonder if the U.S. would have to protect Burke if he's really in danger from a foreign government operating on U.S. soil.
Man, this case is full of twists and turns. We've gone from online posts to extortion, and now maybe even international espionage. It's like watching a spy movie unfold.
It really goes to show you how connected the world is these days. What happens in one place can affect people and governments all over.
So, for our listeners out there, what's the biggest takeaway from all this? What should they be thinking about as they follow this case?
I think the most important thing is to remember that what happens online isn't separate from the real world. The lines are blurring, and things you do online can have serious consequences offline. This case is a big example of that. It also shows just how hard it is to figure out legal stuff in the digital age, where information can go anywhere instantly.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening.
Yeah.
It shows how complex things are when you talk about international law, free speech, and how the digital world is changing our lives.
It really has been fascinating. This story shows how important it is to talk about these things, think critically, and understand all the sides of these complicated issues.
We've just scratched the surface of this case, but we hope you learned something new and have some things to think about. Keep learning and stay informed about what happens next.
And remember, the world is more connected than ever, and that means we need to be responsible for what we do, both online and offline. What we do can affect people all over the world.
Very well said. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.